A distracted millionaire lost sight of his daughter. Minutes later, he found her with a beggar and couldn't believe what he was doing to her. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the luxurious residence in the Upper East Side, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in New York City. Alexander Rivers, 40 years old, was already awake, with his phone glued to his ear as he paced back and forth in his spacious office. His usually firm and authoritative voice now carried an undertone of barely contained urgency. No, Charles. We needed those permits yesterday. The development in Soho can't be delayed another day, he insisted, rubbing his temple with his free hand. I'll pull whatever strings you need at City Hall, but I want those papers on my desk first thing Monday morning. Alexander hung up the call and exhaled deeply, allowing himself a moment of quiet before the day officially began. His gaze landed on a framed photograph on his desk, a younger version of himself, smiling and embracing a beautiful woman with dark hair and sparkling eyes. Maria, his late wife. 2 years had passed since the accident, but the pain was still as fresh as the first day. A soft knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he said, quickly regaining his composure. Mrs. Lewis, the housekeeper who had been with the family for over a decade, poked her head in. "Mr. Rivers, little Sophie is already awake. Should I serve breakfast?" Alexander glanced at his luxury watch and frowned. It was Sunday, the day he had promised to spend with his daughter. "No, thank you, Mrs. Lewis. I'll take care of breakfast today." The surprise on Mrs. Lewis's face was evident, but she simply nodded and closed the door quietly. Alexander made his way to the kitchen, where he found his 5-year-old daughter Sophie sitting at the table, her legs swinging as they barely reached the floor. With her black hair tied into 2 ponytails and wearing princess pajamas, she was the spitting image of Maria. "Good morning, Princess," Alexander greeted, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. Sophie looked up from her coloring book. "Hi, Daddy," she responded with a shy smile, as if unsure how to react to her father's unusual presence at this time. A pang of guilt hit Alexander. When had his presence become something rare for his own daughter? "How about we do something special today?" he suggested, trying to sound enthusiastic. "We could go to Central Park after breakfast." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we go to the zoo?" "Of course," Alexander nodded, though internally he was already calculating how much work he could catch up on his tablet while they strolled through the park. After a breakfast of Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, courtesy of Mrs. Lewis, who discreetly took over when she saw Alexander struggling with the batter, father and daughter headed to Central Park. The park was bustling with activity on this sunny Sunday. Families strolled down the paths, street vendors hawked their wares, and the aroma of roasted corn and cotton candy filled the air. Alexander felt out of place in his designer shirt and Italian shoes, but Sophie was in her element, her big eyes trying to take in everything at once. "Daddy, look at the balloons," Sophie exclaimed, pointing to a vendor with a massive bundle of colorful balloons. Alexander was about to respond when his phone vibrated in his pocket. Automatically, he pulled it out, frowning at the name on the screen. It was Charles, probably with news about the permits. "Just a minute, sweetie," he murmured distractedly, stepping away to take the call. The conversation dragged on longer than expected. Charles had made some progress with the permits, but new complications had arisen with the investors. Alexander got caught up in the discussion, momentarily forgetting where he was and why. It was the scream of a woman that finally pulled him out of his bubble. "Watch out for the girl!" Alexander spun around, phone still in hand, and his heart stopped. Sophie was no longer by his side. He spun in place, frantically scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of his daughter. "Sophie!" he shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Sophie?" People around him began to notice his distress. Some stopped to ask what was wrong, offering to help search, but Alexander barely heard them. His mind was flooded with terrible images. Sophie lost, scared, or worse. He ran down the path, shouting his daughter's name, his heart pounding in his ears. How could he have been so careless? How could he lose sight of the only thing he had left of Maria, after what felt like an eternity but was only a few minutes? Alexander spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the lake. Relief flooded him for a moment, only to be replaced by a fresh wave of panic. Sophie wasn't alone. Next to her, talking animatedly, was a scruffy-looking man. He wore worn-out clothes and had a disheveled beard. In his hands, he held something Alexander couldn't make out from the distance. Without thinking, Alexander ran toward them, bracing for the worst. But as he got closer, the scene before him began to take shape in an unexpected way. Sophie didn't seem scared or in danger. In fact, she was laughing, her eyes glued to the man's hands. When Alexander finally reached the bench, breathless and with his heart still racing, he realized what was really happening. The man was holding a small wooden figure, skillfully carving it with a pocket knife. Sophie watched the process in fascination, completely unaware of the panic her disappearance had caused. Sophie," Alexander exclaimed, drawing the attention of both. "Daddy," Sophie responded with a smile. "Look what Mr. John is making. It's magical." The man, John, looked up at Alexander. His eyes, though tired, reflected a calm and kindness that contrasted with his overall appearance. "You must be this little one's father," he said softly. "She was a bit scared when I found her, so I thought I'd distract her while we waited for you to show up." Alexander was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to process the situation. The fear and anger he had felt moments ago were now mingling with a confusing sense of gratitude and shame. Thank you," he finally managed to say, taking Sophie's hand. "I shouldn't have gotten distracted." "I'm so sorry, Sophie." John smiled, finishing the last details of the wooden figure. It was a small hummingbird, carved with surprising detail. "No need to apologize," he said, offering the figure to Sophie. "Accidents happen. What's important is that she's safe." Sophie took the hummingbird reverently, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Thank you, Mr. John." Still stunned by the events, Alexander pulled out his wallet. "Please, let me pay you for your time and for the figure," he insisted, extending a few high-denomination bills. John shook his head as he stood up. "That's not necessary, sir. Your daughter's smile is payment enough." With a wave, he began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd before Alexander could insist. Father and daughter stood there, watching the direction John had gone. Alexander looked at Sophie, who gently caressed the wooden hummingbird, and felt a wave of emotions he couldn't name. "Let's go home, sweetie," he finally said, gently squeezing his daughter's hand. As they walked toward the park's exit, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about John and his selfless act of kindness. When had he himself last done something without expecting anything in return? When had he stopped seeing the value in the simple things, like a child's smile? The wooden hummingbird in Sophie's hand seemed to weigh much more than its physical grams. It was a tangible reminder that in his pursuit of success and wealth, Alexander had lost sight of the truly important things in life. As they climbed into the car, Alexander made a decision. This couldn't continue. Something had to change. And that change, he realized, had to start with him. Monday morning arrived with the relentless force of routine. Alexander Rivers found himself seated in his office on the 30th floor of a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan, the financial heart of New York City. From his window, he could see Central Park stretching out like a green oasis amidst the concrete and traffic. His mind kept replaying the events of the previous day. The image of Sophie laughing with John, the scruffy but kind artisan, overlapped with the documents on his desk. The permits he had so urgently pressed Charles for now lay forgotten beneath a cup of cold coffee. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, straightening up in his Italian leather chair. Valerie, his personal assistant, walked in holding a tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Rivers. Here's your agenda for today. You have a meeting with the Soho project investors in an hour, lunch with the city planning commissioner, and in the afternoon—" Alexander interrupted her with a wave of his hand. "Valerie, can you do me a favor? Look into any support programs for local artisans, especially those affected by natural disasters." Valerie blinked in surprise. In the 5 years she had worked for Alexander, she had never heard him express interest in something like that. "Of course, Mr. Rivers. Any particular reason?" "Just curiosity," Alexander replied, avoiding further explanation. "Oh, and one more thing. I want you to block off an hour every afternoon this week. Label it important meeting, but really, I'm leaving early to spend time with Sophie." The surprise on Valerie's face deepened, but she maintained her professional composure. "As you wish, Mr. Rivers. Anything else?" Alexander shook his head, and Valerie left the office, leaving him alone with his thoughts once again. As the day progressed, Alexander found himself distracted in his meetings. During lunch with the city planning commissioner, a pompous man named Roberts, he caught himself asking about policies supporting artisan communities. "Well, Rivers," Roberts replied, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, "honestly, that's not a priority for the city. Artisans are part of the city's charm. Sure, but the future lies in modern urban development. Like your Soho project, that's real progress." Alexander nodded absently, feeling an unease he couldn't quite explain. How many times had he expressed similar sentiments himself? That afternoon, true to his word, Alexander left the office at 4 p.m. When he arrived home, he found Sophie in the garden, playing with the wooden hummingbird John had given her. "Daddy!" she exclaimed upon seeing him, running to give him a hug. "You're home early." Alexander scooped her up, feeling the day's stress melt away. "Oh, that's right, princess. How about we go get some ice cream?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Can we go to Roxy's ice cream parlor? They have the best chocolate ice cream in the world." Alexander laughed. "The best in the world? We'll have to see about that." As they walked down the neighborhood streets toward the ice cream shop, Sophie chattered happily about her day at school. Alexander listened attentively, marveling at how much she had grown without him truly noticing. At the shop, a small family-owned place that had been around for decades, Sophie ordered chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. Alexander opted for vanilla, remembering it had been Maria's favorite. "Mommy always ordered vanilla," Sophie said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "That's right, sweetheart. Do you remember her?" Sophie nodded, licking her ice cream thoughtfully. "Sometimes, I remember her laugh, and how she used to sing when she cooked." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood in. Maria in the kitchen, making breakfast while singing rancheras at the top of her lungs. Maria laughing as they painted Sophie's room. Maria gently scolding him for working too much. "Your mommy was an incredible woman," he said finally, opening his eyes to look at his daughter. "And you're so much like her." Sophie smiled, a smile that was an exact echo of Maria's. "Really, mister?" John said I reminded him of someone too. Alexander tensed slightly at the mention of John's name. "Oh, really? What else did Mr. John say?" "He told me he used to live in a town far away and made big wooden sculptures. But then there was an earthquake and he lost his workshop. Now he makes smaller ones because they're easier to carry." The story resonated with Alexander. He remembered the news of the earthquake in a rural town years ago. At the time, he had barely paid attention, too absorbed in a major real estate project. "Does he ever miss making the big sculptures?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. Sophie shrugged. "He said that sometimes the small things are the most important, like the hummingbird he gave me. He said hummingbirds are small but very brave." As they finished their ice cream, Alexander reflected on John's words. When had he stopped valuing the small things? When had the next big project become more important than moments like these with his daughter? Back home, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, can we go back to the park next Sunday? I want to thank Mr. John for the hummingbird." Alexander hesitated for a moment. His business instincts told him it was a bad idea to seek out a stranger in the park. But something else, something that sounded suspiciously like Maria's voice, told him this was an important opportunity. "Of course, sweetheart," he finally replied. "Next Sunday we'll go to the park." The rest of the week passed in a strange balance between Alexander's usual routine and his newfound attempts to reconnect with Sophie. Every afternoon, he left the office early to spend time with her. They played board games, watched princess movies which Alexander found surprisingly entertaining, and even tried baking cookies, a delicious disaster in the kitchen. At work, Alexander found himself increasingly distracted. The financial reports and architectural plans that had once excited him now seemed cold and distant. Instead, he found himself reading through the reports Valerie had prepared on artisan support programs. By Friday afternoon, as he was reviewing some contracts, Charles barged into his office without knocking, as was his habit. "Alex, we've got a problem with the Soho project," he said bluntly. "The neighborhood is organizing protests. They say the development is going to destroy a green space and displace several families." In the past, Alexander would have reacted with irritation. seeing this as just another obstacle to overcome. But today, he found himself thinking about John, about the families who had lost their homes in the earthquake, about the small things that sometimes matter the most. "What do you propose?" he asked Charles, his voice calm. Charles seemed surprised by the lack of reaction. "Well, we could apply pressure through our contacts at City Hall, or maybe offer compensation to the most vocal protesters." Alexander shook his head. "No, I want you to revisit the project. Let's see if we can modify it to preserve the green space and integrate the existing community. Maybe a mixed-use development with room for local businesses." Charles stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "But Alex, that would significantly reduce our profit margins. The investors won't be happy." "Let me worry about the investors," Alexander said, surprising even himself with his decision. "Sometimes the small things are the most important." That night, as Alexander sat down to dinner with Sophie, he found himself thinking about Maria. What would she think of the man he had become? Would she be proud of the empire he had built or disappointed by the personal cost it had taken? "Daddy, are you sad?" Sophie suddenly asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Alexander looked at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "No, honey. I was just thinking." "About what?" "About your mom. About you. About how things have changed." Sophie looked at him with her big brown eyes. So much like Maria's. "I think about Mommy sometimes too. But then I remember she always said to smile. Even when we're sad." Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. It was true, Maria had always been a beacon of optimism, even in the hardest times. When had he lost that ability? "Your mom was very wise," he said finally, forcing a smile. "And you're just as wise as she was." That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Alexander found himself in his study, flipping through old photo albums, images of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. Alexander and Maria, young and laughing on the beach, their wedding in a small church. The day Sophie was born, with Maria radiant, holding their baby, and Alexander by her side, a mixture of pride and fear on his face. One particular photo caught his attention. It showed Maria sitting on a bench in Central Park, pregnant with Sophie, smiling while holding a small wooden figure. Alexander remembered that day. They had been walking in the park when they came across a vendor selling handmade wooden sculptures. Maria had fallen in love with a small Quetzal figure, and Alexander had bought it for her, happy to see her so delighted by something so simple. The coincidence hit him like a wave. Could John be the same artisan from all those years ago, or was his mind just playing tricks on him, looking for connections where none existed? Alexander stayed up late that night, his mind swirling with memories, doubts, and possibilities. When he finally went to bed, he did so with a renewed determination. Whoever John was, and whatever reasons fate had for bringing him into their lives, Alexander was resolved to make the most of this opportunity to reconnect with what truly mattered in life. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Sunday dawned with a clear sky over New York City, as if the universe itself wanted to ease Alexander and Sophie's plans. As they prepared to leave, Alexander couldn't help feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Would they really find John again? And if they did, what was he hoping to achieve? "Are you ready, Daddy?" Sophie asked, interrupting his thoughts. She stood at the door, clutching the small wooden hummingbird as if it were a lucky charm. Alexander smiled, touched by his daughter's enthusiasm. "Ready, Princess. Let's go find your friend John." Central Park was buzzing with activity, even more so than the previous Sunday. Families were out enjoying the sunny day, picnicking, walking, or visiting the zoo. Alexander and Sophie wandered through the paths, keeping an eye out for any sign of John or other artisans. After almost an hour of searching with no luck, Sophie started to look tired. "Daddy, what if Mr. John didn't come to the park today?" Alexander was about to suggest they take a break when a familiar sound caught his attention, the soft scrape of a knife against wood. Following the sound, they finally spotted him. John was sitting on the same bench where they had found him last week, working on a new carving. "Mr. John!" Sophie shouted, running toward him with the hummingbird in hand. John looked up, his tired face breaking into a smile as he recognized the little girl. "Hello there, little one. What a surprise to see you again." Alexander approached more slowly, observing the interaction. John was dressed in the same worn clothes as before, but there was something about his posture, the way he held his knife in the wood, that spoke of dignity and pride in his work. "Mr. John," Alexander said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally for helping my daughter last week." John shook his hand firmly. "There's no need to thank me, sir. Anyone would have done the same." Alexander wasn't so sure about that, but he decided not to argue. Instead, he sat down on the bench next to John while Sophie settled on the ground in front of them, fascinated by the new carving the artisan was working on. "May I ask you something, John?" Alexander said after a moment of silence. John nodded, continuing to work on his carving. "How long have you been coming to this park to sell your figures?" John thought for a moment. "About 2 years, give or take. Since I lost my workshop in the earthquake." Alexander's heart sped up. "And before that? Did you ever work here in the park?" John looked at him curiously. "Well, yes, many years ago I used to come on weekends. I was younger then, and my sculptures were much bigger." "Why do you ask?" With trembling hands, Alexander pulled out his phone and searched for the photo he had found the night before. He showed it to John. Maria, pregnant, sitting on a bench in Central Park, smiling with the small wooden quetzal in her hands. John's eyes widened in surprise. "My goodness," he murmured. "I remember that day. That young woman was so happy with the quetzal. Wait, is that you in the picture?" Alexander nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "That's Maria, my wife. She was pregnant with Sophie." John looked at Sophie, still engrossed in watching him carve, unaware of the adults' conversation. "The world is small," he said softly. "How is your wife? She must be so proud to see how her daughter has grown." Alexander's silence was enough of an answer. John's expression softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. Alexander cleared his throat, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "John, I'd like to help you. I know you lost your workshop in the earthquake. Maybe I could—" John raised a hand, gently cutting him off. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I don't need charity. I've learned to live with what I have." "It's not charity," Alexander insisted. "It's an investment in art, in culture. We could set up a workshop, maybe even a school for young artisans." John looked at him with a mix of amusement and skepticism. "And why would a businessman like you want to do that?" The question hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Why indeed? Was it just guilt? An attempt to make up for years of neglecting the small things in life? Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was Charles. Alexander hesitated for a moment before answering. "Alex, we've got a problem." Charles's voice was tense. "The investors heard about the changes you proposed for the Soho project. They're furious. They're threatening to pull out if we don't go back to the original plan." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. "I understand, Charles. Let me handle it." He hung up and looked at John, who was watching him with curiosity and concern. "Work trouble, I suppose," the artisan said. Alexander nodded. John, I need to ask you a favor. Could you watch Sophie for a few minutes? I need to make an important call." John agreed, and Alexander stepped away a few paces, dialing the number for Roberts, the city planning commissioner. "Rivers, and what a surprise." Roberts's voice was jovial. "How can I help you on this fine Sunday?" "Roberts, I need your support," Alexander said, getting straight to the point. "I want to modify the Soho project to include green spaces and spaces for local businesses. The investors are resisting." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Alex," Roberts finally said, his tone now serious, "you know I've always supported you. But what you're asking is complicated. There are a lot of interests at stake." "I know," Alexander replied. "But it's the right thing to do. Think of the positive impact it would have on the community. It could even be a model for future developments in the city." Roberts sighed. "Look, I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. I have to warn you, though, this could have consequences, not just for the project, but for your reputation in the business world." "I'm willing to take that risk," Alexander said, with a determination that surprised even himself. After hanging up, Alexander stood in the park for a moment, lost in thought. Was he doing the right thing? Or was he risking everything he had built for a whim? When he returned to the bench, he found Sophie laughing as John showed her how to carve a small flower out of wood. The scene hit him with sudden clarity. This was what mattered. These moments, these connections. "John Rackrey," Alexander said, sitting back down, "I want to tell you about the project I'm working on." For the next hour, Alexander told John about the Soho development, about the changes he wanted to make, and the resistance he was facing. John listened carefully, occasionally asking insightful questions. "Mr. Rivers," John finally said, "I understand why you want to help me, and I appreciate it. But I think your project is much more important than an old artisan like me. If you succeed, you'll help a lot more people." Alexander was speechless for a moment. "But what about your workshop? Your art?" John smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "My workshop is here," he said, gesturing to the park around them. "Wait, and my art? Well, my art lives on in every person who takes one of my carvings and treasures it. Like your daughter with her hummingbird." Sophie, who had been listening to the conversation without fully understanding, proudly held up her hummingbird. "It's my treasure," she exclaimed. John laughed. "See? That's more valuable than any workshop." Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "John, would you allow me to buy some of your figures? For my office? And maybe you could come by from time to time to teach Sophie how to carve?" Sophie's eyes lit up at the suggestion. John seemed to consider it for a moment before nodding. "It would be an honor, Mr. Rivers." As they walked home that afternoon, Sophie chattered excitedly about the carving lessons she would have, proudly holding the small wooden flower she had made under John's guidance. Alexander listened, his mind split between his daughter's joy and the uncertainty of the challenges that awaited him. The next day, Alexander arrived at his office earlier than usual. He found Valerie already at her desk, looking worried. "Mr. Rivers," she said as soon as she saw him, "the investors have been calling all morning. They're very upset. And there are reporters asking about rumors of changes to the Soho project." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. "Thank you, Valerie. Please schedule a press conference for this afternoon. And call Charles, I need to speak with him urgently." The next few hours were a whirlwind of tense meetings and heated phone calls. The investors threatened legal action, the contractors expressed concerns about the changes, and competitors began circulating rumors about the financial stability of Alexander's company. By mid-afternoon, exhausted but resolute, Alexander stood before a group of reporters in his company's conference room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I'm here today to announce significant changes to our Soho development project." For the next 20 minutes, Alexander explained his vision of a development that respected the environment and the local community. He spoke of green spaces, of areas for local businesses, of a project that wouldn't just generate profits but would also improve the quality of life for the residents. "I know these changes won't be easy," he concluded. "I know there will be challenges and obstacles, but I firmly believe it's the right thing to do, not just for Soho, but for the future of our city." The reporters' questions were aggressive, questioning the financial viability of the project and the motivations behind this sudden change of heart. Alexander answered calmly, without revealing the personal events that had led to this decision. When he finally returned to his office, he felt drained but strangely at peace. On his desk, he found the small wooden figures he had bought from John the day before: a quetzal, a hummingbird, and a flower. He carefully arranged them next to the photo of Maria and Sophie. His phone rang. It was Roberts. "Rivers," the commissioner's voice was a mix of admiration and concern. "I just saw your press conference. It was impressive, but you've stirred up a storm. There are a lot of powerful people who aren't happy about these changes." "I know, Roberts," Alexander replied, "but it's a risk I'm willing to take." "Well, you have my support," Roberts said after a pause. "It won't be easy, but I think we can make this work. It could be a model for future developments in the city." After hanging up, Alexander stood at his window, looking out at Central Park in the distance. He thought of John, of his calloused hands working the wood with patience and love. He thought of Maria, of her laughter and her ability to find joy in simple things. And he thought of Sophie, of the way her eyes lit up when she learned something new. His phone rang again. This time it was Charles. Alex, his friend and business partner, sounded exhausted. The main investors want an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Things don't look good, buddy. Alexander sighed. I understand, Charles. I'll be there. Alex, Charles continued, his voice filled with concern. Are you sure about this? We've worked so hard to get where we are. This project could sink us if it goes wrong. Alexander glanced at the wooden figures on his desk, symbols of a world he was just beginning to rediscover. And I know, Charles, but sometimes you have to risk everything for what truly matters. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Alexander Rivers. The Soho project, now rebranded as Harmony District, became the center of attention in both the real estate industry and the media in New York City. Every day brought new challenges, negotiations with contractors bewildered by the sudden change in plans, meetings with skeptical community leaders, and late nights spent reviewing budgets to ensure the project remained financially viable without compromising his vision. But amid the chaos, Alexander found a new sense of balance and purpose. Every Sunday, without fail, he took Sophie to Central Park for her carving lessons with John. And every Sunday, as he watched his daughter learn the delicate art of bringing wood to life, he felt that he was rediscovering a part of himself he had long forgotten. One Sunday afternoon, as John was teaching Sophie how to carve the feathers of a quetzal, Alexander received a call from Charles. Alex, we've got problems. His partner's voice was tense. The project costs are spiraling out of control. The investors are getting nervous. We need to make some tough decisions. Alexander looked at Sophie, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on her carving. He thought about the families who would benefit from the project, the artisans who would have a space to showcase their work, the park that would be preserved. I understand, Charles, he finally replied. But we're not compromising our vision. Find a way to make it work. After hanging up, Alexander walked over to John, who was watching Sophie's progress with a proud smile. John, Alexander said, I need your advice again. The artisan looked at him with curiosity. What's the problem, Mr. Rivers? Alexander explained the situation with the project, the financial challenges and the pressure to make compromises. John listened intently, his hands moving automatically as he worked on a new carving. When Alexander finished, John showed him the figure he had been carving, a tree with deep roots and branches stretching toward the sky. Do you see this tree, Mr. Rivers? John asked. And its roots are strong but flexible. They adapt to the ground without losing their essence. Its branches reach for the sun but also provide shade and shelter. That's how your project should be. Alexander studied the carving, reflecting on John's words. You're saying we should be flexible but without losing sight of our goal? John nodded. Exactly. Maybe there are ways to reduce costs without sacrificing the heart of the project. Perhaps some of the local artisans can contribute their work, creating unique spaces that will attract more people. Or maybe you can use sustainable materials that, although more expensive at first, will save money in the long run. That night, inspired by John's wisdom, Alexander called an emergency meeting with his team. For hours, they brainstormed new ideas and approaches, looking for creative ways to maintain the integrity of the project while adjusting to financial realities. As the weeks went by, the Harmony District began to take shape. What had initially been met with skepticism was now gaining the community's support. The media praised the project as a model of sustainable and socially responsible urban development. One day, while Alexander was overseeing the construction progress, he ran into Roberts, the city planning commissioner. Rivers, Roberts greeted him with a smile. I have to admit, I was wrong about this project. What you're doing here, it's impressive. Alexander smiled, remembering their conversation months ago. Thanks, Roberts. It hasn't been easy, but I think we're creating something special here. Roberts nodded, looking around the site. You know, we're considering implementing some of your ideas in future urban development projects. Your approach could change the way we build in this city. Those words echoed in Alexander's mind for days. The idea that his project could have an impact beyond Soho, that it could influence the future of the city, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the project progressed, Alexander noticed changes not just in his surroundings but within himself. He no longer lived for closing deals or quarterly profits. He found satisfaction in small victories. A preserved green space, a community center created, a local artisan finding a new home for their workshop. And most importantly, his relationship with Sophie blossomed. The carving lessons with John had become a sacred ritual for both of them, a time to connect and grow together. Alexander discovered that he had a surprising talent for carving, and soon he and Sophie were competing to see who could create the most beautiful figure. One evening, as they worked together in the studio Alexander had set up at home, Sophie paused in her carving and looked at her father with a serious expression. "Daddy," she said, "do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at the photo of Maria, which now held a place of honor next to their carving tools, and then at his daughter, who had grown so much in the past few months. "I'm sure of it, Princess," he replied, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I'm sure of it." That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Alexander stayed up reflecting on the path he had traveled. He thought about the man he used to be, obsessed with success and profit, and the man he was becoming. He thought about John, with his simple but profound wisdom, and how a chance encounter in the park had changed the course of his life. As he looked out the window at the city lights, Alexander realized he had found something that money couldn't buy: inner peace and a sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and full of challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive, truly himself. With a smile, Alexander picked up a piece of wood and began to carve. He didn't know exactly what he was creating, but he knew that, like his life, it would take shape with patience, love, and dedication. The morning sun bathed New York City in a golden glow as Alexander Rivers adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. Today was the official opening of Harmony District, the project that had transformed not just Soho, but also Alexander's own life. "Are you nervous, Daddy?" Sophie, now 8 years old, asked from the doorway. She wore a beautiful blue dress and held a small wooden box she had carved herself. Alexander smiled and knelt down to her level. "A little, Princess, but I'm also excited. How about you? Ready for your big moment?" Sophie nodded with determination. "Mr. John says I'm ready. We practiced a lot." Alexander's heart swelled with pride. Over the 3 years since the project had begun, Sophie had blossomed, not only as a talented carver but also as a thoughtful, compassionate girl who cared deeply about her community. Together, father and daughter headed to the grand opening. The Harmony District was an impressive sight. Modern buildings, designed to blend harmoniously with the preserved green spaces, stood alongside vibrant artisan workshops and galleries. As guests began arriving, city officials, investors, community members, and journalists, Alexander felt a mixture of pride and humility. This project was more than just his achievement. It was the result of a community's effort and vision. Among the crowd, Alexander spotted John, dressed in a crisp white shirt for the occasion. The old artisan, who now led the training program for young carvers in Harmony District, gave Alexander a nod of approval and a warm smile. When it was time for his speech, Alexander took the stage with Sophie by his side. He looked out at the crowd, and for a moment, the weight of the moment hit him. "3 years ago," he began, "I thought I knew everything about success and progress. I believed they were measured in square feet built and quarterly profits. But a series of unexpected encounters taught me an invaluable lesson. Real progress is measured in lives improved, communities strengthened, and traditions preserved." He paused, looking over at John in the crowd. "I learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. That wisdom isn't always found in boardrooms but on park benches, in the hands of an artisan, or in the laughter of a child." Alexander continued, explaining how Harmony District wasn't just a real estate project but an experiment in community building. He spoke about the green spaces they had preserved, the workshops for local artisans, and the affordable housing they had integrated into the development. "But perhaps the achievement I'm most proud of," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the program we've established for young artisans. And to tell you more about that, I'd like to introduce someone very special." With that, Alexander stepped back, and Sophie stepped forward to the microphone. There were murmurs of surprise and smiles of affection from the crowd. Hello," Sophie began, her voice clear and confident. "My name is Sophie Rivers, and I'm 8 years old. 3 years ago, I met a man named Mr. John in the park. He taught me that with patience and love, you can make something beautiful out of a simple piece of wood. He showed me that our hands can make magic." Sophie opened the small wooden box she had been holding and pulled out a beautifully carved figure, a tree, much like the one John had carved for her. But this tree had small houses nestled in its branches and figures of people gathered around its roots. "This tree represents our Harmony District," Sophie explained. "The roots are our history and traditions. The trunk is us and growing together, and the branches are our dreams, reaching toward the future. The houses and the people remind us that we're all part of this community." The audience was captivated. Alexander noticed tears in the eyes of many, including John, who watched Sophie with pride as if she were his own granddaughter. "In our Young Artisan program," Sophie continued, "we learn more than just how to carve wood. We learn about our culture, about working together, about creating things that make people happy. And we want to invite all the kids who want to learn to join us." With that, Sophie gave a small bow and the crowd erupted in applause. Alexander hugged his daughter tightly, his heart bursting with pride. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of ribbon cutting, tours, and interviews. But for Alexander, the highlight of the day came at the very end when most of the guests had left. He found himself standing in the new Central Park of Harmony District, with Sophie by his side and John in front of them. The setting sun bathed the city in warm hues of gold and pink. "You did it, Mr. Rivers," John said, his voice full of emotion. "You created something beautiful here, something that will last." Alexander shook his head, smiling. "No, John, we did it, all of us. You showed me the way when I was lost. You reminded me of what really matters in life." John nodded, his eyes shining. "You know, when I lost my workshop in the earthquake, I thought I had lost my purpose in life. But now I see that was just the beginning of a new chapter. Thanks to you and Sophie, I've been able to pass on my knowledge to a new generation. That's a gift that has no price." Sophie, who had been quietly listening, suddenly hugged John tightly. "Thank you for teaching me, Grandpa John," she said, using the affectionate title she had adopted for the old artisan. Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he watched the scene. He thought of Maria and how proud she would have been of Sophie, of the woman their daughter was becoming. He thought of the long and sometimes difficult journey that had brought him to this moment. As the sun set over Harmony District, Alexander Rivers realized that he had found something far more valuable than business success. He had found a sense of purpose, a community, and a way to honor the past while building a better future. Come on," Alexander finally said, placing a hand on John's shoulder and the other on Sophie's. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us. This is just the beginning." And so, as the first stars began to appear in the New York sky, 3 generations walked together into the future, united by love, art, and the vision of a more harmonious world.